An entire empire's laws were once painted onto the world, not written down. A splash of crimson could declare war, and a stripe of gold could demand your taxes. This was the forgotten reality of chromatic governance, a system where pigment held more power than words. By the end of this journey, you will understand how color served as the original operating system for human civilization. We will explore cities that ran on secret color codes and uncover why a system so intuitive could vanish from history. What do you think it would be like to live in a world governed by color? The world's first bureaucracy was not built on paper, but on pigment. In the sun-baked cities of ancient Mesopotamia, administrators discovered that color could bring order to a growing empire. They began using different colored clay tablets to manage their records. A tablet of deep ochre might detail grain taxes, while one of pale buff could record a legal judgment. This was not merely for organization. The true genius lay in the scarcity of the colors themselves. Producing a vibrant, lasting pigment was a complex and expensive art, known only to a few specialists. A common farmer could not simply replicate the brilliant lapis lazuli blue reserved for royal proclamations. This inherent difficulty made certain colors impossible to forge, granting them an immediate and unquestionable authority. Archaeological digs at sites like Uruk provide stunning proof of this system. They have uncovered small cylinder seals, intricately carved with symbols, but it is the color of the stone that held the real power. A seal made from common limestone granted a merchant the right to trade in a local market, but a seal carved from vibrant red carnelian or deep green serpentine signified a high-ranking official, someone who could authorize construction projects or levy taxes on entire districts. The message was instant and universal. An illiterate farmer did not need to read cuneiform script to understand that the man holding the red seal demanded his obedience. This created a silent, visual hierarchy that everyone could understand, making the complex machinery of government accessible while ensuring that ultimate control remained firmly in the hands of the elite who possessed the rarest hues. This was humanity's first great experiment in symbolic bureaucracy, a system where the very sight of a color could command a city. This silent language of power found its most beautiful expression far to the east, in the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley. The Harappan civilization presents one of history's most profound mysteries, a vast society that flourished for centuries yet left behind no deciphered written records, no great statues of kings, no epic poems of conquest. So how did they govern? The answer appears to be painted in a single, breathtaking color. Archaeologists excavating sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa itself have uncovered something astonishing. The administrative centers, the large structures believed to house their leaders and bureaucrats, were not just buildings. They were statements coated in a brilliant blue glaze made from powdered lapis lazuli. This was not mere decoration. It was a public declaration of authority, a visual code that everyone in the city could read. The system was remarkably sophisticated. The intensity of the blue acted as a gradient of importance. A building with a pale, sky blue wash likely dealt with local matters, perhaps the allocation of water rights or the organization of a neighborhood harvest. But a structure gleaming with a deep, almost vibrating ultramarine, the color of a midnight sky, was the heart of power. That was the color of royal proclamations, of laws that governed trade across the civilization, of decrees that affected every citizen. You would not need to read a single word to understand your place in this society. You simply had to look at the blue. The most compelling evidence for this chromatic code comes not from the grand buildings, but from small, broken pieces of pottery. Recent digs have uncovered countless shards, each painted with a specific shade and pattern. A shard with a single dark blue stripe might have been a trader's permit, allowing its bearer to move goods through the city gates. Another, covered in a complex pattern of light blue dots, could have been a receipt for taxes paid in grain. These colored tokens may have functioned as an early, non-monetary economy, a system of pure information where the pigment itself carried the value and the command. The utter absence of any other clear legal text makes this reliance on color not just a tool, but the entire foundation of their governance. We are left with a civilization that spoke to itself in hues, a silent, efficient, and stunningly beautiful bureaucracy that vanished, leaving only fragments of blue to tell its story. This reliance on a single color's authority was not unique, but on the island of Crete, the Minoans perfected a far more complex system. They painted their entire economy crimson. Across the island, from the great palace of Knossos to the smallest coastal village, stood large clay storage jars called pithoi. These were not simply containers, they were the beating heart of the Minoan tax system, and each one was coated in a specific shade of red ochre. The color was a public announcement, a silent tax code that every citizen could understand. A jar painted with a light, rusty red might signal that it was a collection point for olive oil. A deeper, blood red hue could indicate it was for grain or barley. The most vivid, almost vermilion jars were often found near palace workshops, reserved for rare materials or precious religious offerings. This was a brilliant and intuitive administrative network. A farmer bringing his goods to a central storehouse did not need to read a single word. He simply looked for the jar painted in the color that matched his produce, and he knew he was fulfilling his obligation to the state. The system's true genius was revealed during times of crisis. In a drought or after an earthquake, the administrators at Knossos could see at a glance, based on the fill levels of these crimson jars, exactly which resources were abundant and which were scarce. This allowed for a rapid and efficient redistribution of food and supplies across the island. If the deep red grain jars in the east were full, but the light red oil jars in the west were nearly empty, supplies could be moved to prevent famine, all without a single written ledger. Archaeological evidence from the palace archives shows this was a highly organized operation. Analysis of pottery shards reveals that the Minoans used at least 5 distinct shades of red, each consistently applied to specific categories of goods, agricultural, commercial, and sacred. This chromatic taxation created a resilient and fluid administration, one that could support vast trade networks and a sophisticated society. It was a government that ran on a gradient of red, a silent, visual contract between the people and their rulers that helped build one of the Mediterranean's most advanced and enigmatic Bronze Age civilizations. The power of these ancient colors was not an accident of nature, but a triumph of human ingenuity. Creating a pigment like Egyptian blue was a feat of early chemistry that required a precise and secret recipe. Artisans had to heat a mixture of quartz sand, copper, a calcium compound like limestone, and an alkali such as natron to a scorching temperature of around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This process created calcium copper silicate crystals, a vibrant and stable blue that could withstand centuries of sunlight without fading. This was not mere paint, it was a state-sanctioned technology. Similarly, the seemingly unbreakable Maya blue of Mesoamerica was a puzzle for centuries. Modern analysis revealed it was a complex hybrid, where an organic dye from the indigo plant was chemically bonded to a specific type of white clay palygoscite through a ritualistic heating process. This created a pigment so resistant to age, weather, and even modern chemical solvents that it seems to possess an almost supernatural permanence. In China, the production of vermilion, the brilliant red synonymous with imperial authority, was an alchemical process fraught with danger. It was typically made from cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide ore mined from deep, hazardous pits. The raw mineral was then carefully ground and heated in a process called sublimation, where it would transform from a solid directly into a vapor before cooling and crystallizing into that iconic, powerful red powder. The sheer difficulty of these processes is what granted these colors their authority. Each pigment was a masterpiece of controlled conditions and rare ingredients, making them incredibly expensive and nearly impossible for anyone outside of state-sponsored workshops to replicate. Their physical properties were just as important as their beauty. This light-fastness and chemical stability meant that a royal decree painted in Egyptian blue would remain as legible and commanding in 100 years as it was on the day it was applied. This permanence made them perfect for encoding laws and designations meant to last for generations. The knowledge of how to produce these colors was guarded as fiercely as any crown jewel, a state secret that ensured the ruling class maintained a monopoly on the very language of power. To control the pigment was to control the message, and in these ancient worlds, the most enduring messages were written not in ink, but in light-fast, chemically stable, and prohibitively expensive color. This silent stratification by color reached its zenith in the sprawling Mesoamerican metropolis of Teotihuacan. While the Minoans used red for goods and the Harappans used blue for buildings, the rulers of this city perfected a system of social control painted in shades of gold. Your position in society was not just indicated by the color of your surroundings, it was dictated by them. The most compelling evidence for this comes from the city's residential compounds. Archaeologists have found that the exterior walls of these homes were painted in a strict gradient of golden yellow ochre. A faint, pale wash the color of dry grass signified a common laborer's dwelling. But as you moved toward the city's center, the yellows deepened into brilliant sunflower hues, and finally, near the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the walls of the elite compounds gleamed with a deep, burnished gold, as if the buildings themselves were forged from precious metal. This color coding was a constant, inescapable reminder of the social order. It extended to every facet of daily life. The elite wore robes dyed with rare yellow pigments, ate from pottery glazed in lustrous gold, and received larger food rations, a practice confirmed by isotopic analysis of skeletons that shows a diet richer in maize for those who lived in the most brightly painted compound. The city's very layout enforced this golden rule. Recent LiDAR scans, which use lasers to map the ground beneath vegetation, have revealed a stunning urban plan. They show a network of pathways connecting the city's districts, but not all paths were created equal. Wide, processional avenues, their surfaces once coated in a golden plaster, connected the pyramids, temples, and elite residences. Meanwhile, the common populace navigated a separate web of narrow, earth-toned alleys. From the moment you left your home, the color of the street beneath your feet told you exactly where you could go and who you were. There was no need for written laws about social segregation or sumptuary codes. The system was perfectly legible to everyone, from the highest priest to the lowest artisan. You understood your place by the color of your wall and the hue of your path, a constant, silent reinforcement of a hierarchy written not in stone, but in light and pigment. The Golden Hierarchy of Teotihuacan was a blunt instrument of power, but the true masters of chromatic communication were the Persian administrators. They transformed simple pigments into a complex cryptographic language. In the sprawling bureaucracy of the Achaemenid Empire, official clay seals were not just stamped with an insignia. They were painted with intricate sequences of color that encoded vital information. A seal might begin with a band of deep indigo, signaling the document's origin in a specific satrapy or province. This would be followed by a stripe of ochre yellow, indicating the type of goods being recorded, perhaps textiles or grain. A final dot of crimson could represent the exact quantity or the tax rate to be applied. This was not decoration, it was data storage. A single, small seal could communicate a multi-part instruction that would otherwise require a lengthy written scroll. Only a trained scribe, one initiated into the empire's color codex, could fully interpret these sequences, making the system both efficient and remarkably secure from common forgery. This system evolved to become even more sophisticated. Persian record keepers began using color gradients, where a slow shift from light blue to a dark navy might encode a journey's progression across a map. They layered colors, painting one translucent hue over another to create a third, unique shade that represented a specific official's authorization. A document bearing a seal with a layered green and yellow pattern, creating a distinct olive tone, could only have been approved by a viceroy, granting it immediate authority across the empire. For centuries, archaeologists viewed these colorful seals as little more than administrative flourishes, but today, advanced digital imaging is finally cracking the code. Multispectral scanners can detect subtle pigment variations invisible to the naked eye, revealing faded layers and minute color shifts that were once part of a precise syntax. What we once saw as random splashes of color are now being understood as structured commands, a secure communication network that managed an empire. This was the pinnacle of chromatic governance, a world where the most sensitive state secrets were not written but painted. But the ultimate fusion of luxury and law was achieved on the high seas by the Phoenician city of Tyre. They wove their entire maritime empire from a single, sacred color, a purple so rare it was worth more than its weight in silver. This was Tyrian purple, a dye painstakingly extracted from the murex sea-snail. It took thousands of crushed snails to produce just a single gram of the pigment, a process so laborious and foul-smelling that the dye works were located downwind of the city. This extreme scarcity was not a flaw, it was the foundation of their power. The rulers of Tyre realized that a color this expensive could not be counterfeited, making it the perfect medium for a maritime legal code. They began dyeing the sails and flags of their official ships in specific shades of this purple, creating a silent language that every sailor in the Mediterranean could understand. A ship approaching a foreign port with a sail of deep, almost blackish purple was making a royal proclamation, its arrival carrying the full authority of the Tyrian state. A vessel flying a banner of a lighter, reddish purple was announcing a pre-negotiated trade agreement, granting it immediate docking rights and favorable tariffs. The most common signal was a bright violet stripe painted along a ship's hull, a kind of maritime passport that identified it as a licensed Tyrian merchant vessel, protected by the city's naval power. This system transformed the chaotic waters of the ancient world into a regulated, color-coded highway. A captain seeing a specific shade of purple on the horizon would instantly know whether the other ship was a diplomatic envoy, a tax-collecting official, or a rival merchant operating under a different set of rules. It was a visual traffic system that governed right-of-way, docking privileges, and even conflict resolution, all without a single word being shouted across the waves. The economic control was absolute because the dye was so prohibitively expensive. Only ships sanctioned and funded by the Tyrian state could afford to display these authoritative colors. An independent merchant trying to fly a counterfeit purple flag would be immediately exposed, not just by the quality of the color, but by the sheer economic impossibility of him possessing it. Evidence from ancient shipwrecks and port facilities confirms this chromatic dominance. Archaeologists have found storage jars at Phoenician trading posts like Carthage that contained residues of Tyrian purple, suggesting they were used to read dye-faded flags on site, maintaining the legal legitimacy of their fleet. More tellingly, excavations of rival Greek port cities show a complete absence of the dye, proving that Tyre maintained a tight monopoly on both the pigment and the power it represented. For centuries, this system of purple proclamations allowed a single city-state to orchestrate the flow of goods, information, and influence across the entire Mediterranean, building an empire not on conquered land but on controlled color. The choice of red for tax collection in Minoan Crete was no accident. Ancient rulers possessed an intuitive, yet remarkably advanced, understanding of color psychology, manipulating human perception to make their governance more efficient and their authority more absolute. They knew that certain hues triggered predictable responses, and they built entire administrative systems around this knowledge. Warm colors like red, orange, and the brilliant yellows of Teotihuacan were consistently deployed for commands that required immediate action. These are the colors of fire and blood, of ripe fruit demanding to be harvested. They signal urgency, danger, and excitement, activating a primal part of our brain. Placing your grain tax into a jar painted a deep, warning red felt instinctively correct, a direct and visceral transaction. Similarly, a royal proclamation delivered on a crimson-stained tablet or a ship's sail dyed in urgent purple demanded immediate attention and compelled obedience on a near-subconscious level. In stark contrast, cool colors like the Harappan blue or certain greens were reserved for permanent laws and established rights. Blue is the color of the sky and the deep sea, elements that are constant, vast, and unchanging. A law painted in lapis lazuli blue was not a temporary decree. It was presented as a fundamental, eternal truth of the universe, as fixed as the heavens themselves. This psychological division is not just a modern interpretation. It is supported by cross-cultural evidence that is simply too consistent to be coincidence. From the yellow hierarchy of Mesoamerica to the red tax codes of the Mediterranean and the blue legal foundations of the Indus Valley, geographically disconnected civilizations arrived at the same symbolic conclusions. They all understood that red commands and blue endures. Modern research into color perception confirms the wisdom behind these ancient systems. Studies repeatedly show that red elevates heart rate and increases alertness, making it perfect for directives that require a swift response. It captures our focus more quickly than any other color. Blue, however, promotes calm and is associated with stability and trust, the very foundations of a lasting legal system. This shared human neurology is the reason these chromatic governments worked so well. An illiterate farmer did not need a lengthy legal education. He only needed his innate human response to color. The sight of a specific pigment told him everything he needed to know, whether to hurry, to pay, or to submit. The state's will was communicated not through complex language, but through the primal language of the eye, creating an intuitive and almost effortless form of social control that was both beautiful and brutally effective. Yet this reliance on primal color psychology would be refined into something far more structured in the city that birthed democracy. In classical Athens, the chaos of public life demanded a new kind of order, and they found it in the starkest of palettes, black and white. The Athenians developed a dual-color legal system that transformed their bustling agora into a remarkably efficient and visually clear courthouse. They painted entire courtrooms to signify their purpose. A chamber coated in a somber, dark black or gray was reserved for criminal cases, trials for murder, treason, or serious theft where the stakes were life and death. The dark walls created an atmosphere of gravity and solemnity, signaling to all who entered that the matters judged here were of the utmost severity. Just steps away, a courtroom gleaming in bright white plaster handled civil disputes, matters of property, debt, and inheritance. The white environment felt more open, less intimidating, suited for the resolution of everyday conflicts between citizens. This color coding extended to the jurors themselves. Each juror was given a set of 2 voting tokens, one made of solid bronze with a hollow axle, and one made of solid bronze with a solid axle. But the true identifiers were their colors. For a criminal trial in a black room, the token for a vote of guilty was often dipped in black pigment, while the token for innocence was left its natural metallic hue. In a white civil chamber, the tokens might be painted white and another color to distinguish between the 2 parties in the dispute. This system eliminated confusion in a society where any citizen could be called to serve as a juror. You did not need to remember complex legal procedures. You simply followed the color of the room and the tokens you were given. The evidence for this sophisticated system is etched into the very stones of the Athenian agora. Archaeologists have unearthed small, painted pottery shards called ostraca, used to vote individuals into exile, but they have also found lead tablets inscribed with legal texts where key phrases are highlighted with black or white paint. A public announcement of a new law might have its most critical clause underlined in stark black, ensuring everyone understood the penalty. This was chromatic jurisprudence at its most elegant, using the simplest of colors to bring clarity and fairness to the complex machinery of democracy. It was a system designed for the citizen, ensuring that justice was not only done, but was seen to be done in the most visually unambiguous terms. This control over color was not just political, it was profoundly economic. The true power of these chromatic governments was rooted in the ground, in the remote mines and distant trade routes that supplied their sacred pigments. To possess a color like lapis lazuli was to hold a piece of the sky, but that piece had to be wrested from the earth at a staggering cost. The sole ancient source for this brilliant blue was a single mountain range in modern-day Afghanistan, a journey of thousands of miles from the administrative centers of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. Caravans laden with the precious stone traversed treacherous mountains and deserts, passing through dozens of intermediary kingdoms, each taking a cut of the value. By the time a single block of raw lapis reached a Harappan workshop, its price was astronomical, making it a commodity as valuable as gold. The state's monopoly on this supply chain was absolute. A merchant caught with an unlicensed piece of lapis lazuli would face severe punishment, not for theft, but for the far greater crime of challenging the state's exclusive right to communicate law. The same was true for cinnabar, the source of imperial vermilion. The largest mines were in Spain, controlled first by the Phoenicians and later by Rome. Controlling these mines was not merely an economic venture, it was a strategic necessity. When Rome conquered a region known for its pigment sources, it was securing more than territory, it was capturing the very means of producing authority. The Spanish cinnabar mines became a state-run enterprise, their output so vital that it was guarded by legions and transported in armed convoys. The economic impact of this pigment industry rippled across ancient economies. The demand for Tyrian purple funded the entire Phoenician naval fleet. The trade in indigo for Maya blue created complex exchange networks that stretched across Mesoamerica. A ruler's ability to fund public works, raise armies, and project power was often directly tied to their control over these rare materials. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of power. The state used its military and economic might to secure the sources of pigment, and those pigments were then used to create the visual symbols that legitimized and reinforced that very same state power. The most vivid laws, the most commanding proclamations, were all painted with materials that were, themselves, products of conquest and commerce. The pigment economy reveals a startling truth that the most abstract systems of symbolic power were always built upon a foundation of raw material control. Yet this sophisticated pigment economy was not the final evolution of chromatic governance. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire wove its entire administration from the threads of a rainbow. They ruled one of history's largest empires, stretching for thousands of miles without a written language. Their bureaucracy did not run on paper or clay, but on an intricate language of knotted, colored chords known as quipus. Each quipu was a complex data storage device, a cascade of strings where the color of each chord was its first and most critical piece of information. A crimson thread might represent a count of the empire's soldiers. A golden yellow one could detail the current year's maize harvest from a specific valley. A deep green cord might catalog the number of llamas in the royal herds. The knots themselves, their type, position, and sequence, held the numerical data, but it was the color that gave those numbers their meaning. A trained quipukamayok, or knot maker, could run his fingers along these cords and recite the exact population of a distant province, the taxes it owed, or the resources it required, all by reading this vibrant, tactile code. This was not a simple mnemonic aid. It was a state-level information technology that allowed the Inca to allocate labor, distribute food during famines, and mobilize armies with breathtaking efficiency. The system's true genius was its scalability and portability. A messenger could carry a quipu across treacherous mountain passes, delivering a dense report on the status of the entire empire in a form that was both lightweight and utterly secure from anyone not trained in the color cipher. Recent research has uncovered something even more profound. This administrative color code was not confined to these knotted records. The same spectrum that organized the empire's data was woven into the very fabric of Inca life. The patterns and colors found in prestigious textiles, those worn by nobles and priests, appear to follow the same symbolic system. A mantle featuring a specific sequence of black, white, and red may have visually represented a particular historical record or a legal principle, turning the elite into walking embodiments of the law. Even their architecture seems to whisper in this color language. Analysis of mortar and plaster from key administrative centers shows that certain walls were intentionally painted with pigments that correspond to the colors found in quipus associated with that building's function. A storage complex for military supplies might have featured accents of the same crimson used in quipu cords for soldier counts. The Inca chromatic bureaucracy was therefore all-encompassing. It was present in the knots that recorded the past, the clothes that displayed status in the present, and the buildings that managed the empire's future. It represents the most comprehensive and integrated system of color-based governance ever developed, a silent, polychrome pulse that kept a vast and mighty civilization beating in perfect, coordinated rhythm. A single, consistent shade of red had to mean the same thing from one end of an empire to the other. For a chromatic government to function, its official pigments could not be open to interpretation. A tax collector in a distant province using a slightly different hue of crimson than the capital's standard could sow doubt, invite fraud, and ultimately undermine the entire system's authority. To solve this, ancient administrators created the world's first color standardization systems. In the Persian Empire, this was a matter of imperial logistics. The central government produced master batches of its official pigments, mixing them to an exact state-approved recipe. These were then distributed across the empire in the form of small, fired clay tablets, each painted with a perfect sample of the required color. A provincial governor would receive a set of these reference tiles, perhaps a dozen small squares showing the exact shade of indigo for trade documents, the precise ochre for grain records, and the correct vermilion for royal decrees. Local artisans were required to match their own mixed pigments to these official samples. This was not a task left to the eye alone. Evidence from administrative texts describes a role known as the color master, a trained official who would oversee this critical process. He would use a simple but effective tool, a polished stone slab, to compare the local pigment against the imperial standard. A tiny amount of each was placed side by side on the stone, mixed with the same binding agent and spread thin. If the two colors matched perfectly under sunlight, the batch was approved. If they did not, the entire supply was rejected, and the artisan could face a heavy fine for producing an unauthorized and therefore legally invalid color. This relentless demand for consistency sparked significant technological innovation. To achieve perfectly uniform particles, artisans developed more efficient grinding mills, using hard, smooth stones to pulverize pigments into an ultrafine powder that would not clump or separate. The search for reliable binding agents was constant. While simple water or animal glue worked for some applications, administrators needed colors that would survive rain, sun, and handling. The Egyptians perfected the use of plant gums like acacia, which created a durable, flexible film. In China, experiments with lacquer, a tree sap that hardened into a waterproof shell, produced pigments that could withstand the elements for centuries. The penalties for violating these color codes were severe, precisely because the crime struck at the heart of state control. In Minoan Crete, a potter caught selling his own version of the official tax jar red would not just be fined, he could lose his right to practice his craft. In Teotihuacan, a nobleman who painted his compound with a gold that was a shade too brilliant, too close to the royal standard, could be accused of sedition, a challenge to the emperor's divine right. His punishment might be the forced repainting of his home in a pale, humble yellow, a public shaming written in pigment. This obsession with color control was not about aesthetics, it was about integrity. The entire credibility of a law, a tax, or a royal command depended on the unwavering consistency of the color that carried its meaning. A government that could not control its own palette could not hope to control its people, a truth these ancient rulers understood in the most vivid terms. For the Maya, the very act of governance was a dialogue with the heavens, and they painted their laws in the colors of the cosmos. Their administrative system was not built on a single, monolithic color, but on a carefully calibrated spectrum of blue and green hues, each shade a distinct rung on a celestial ladder of power. This was not merely decoration. The specific pigment we call Maya blue was just one star in a wider constellation of turquoise, verdant green, and deep aqua, each with its own divine meaning. A local administrator overseeing the collection of cocoa beans or cloth in a small village might authorize a transaction with a seal bearing a pale, almost seafoam green. This color was associated with growth, water, and the earthly realm, suitable for mundane records. But as authority climbed, the colors deepened. A high priest or regional governor would use a richer, more vibrant turquoise, a color linked to the life-giving rains and the god Chok. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the divine king, the Keuhul Azure, whose proclamations were rendered in the most profound and sacred shade of all, the brilliant, almost supernatural Maya blue. This specific hue was more than a command, it was a statement of essence. It represented the heavenly vault, the realm of the supreme creator god Itzamna, and the king's unique ability to channel that divine power onto earth. This chromatic hierarchy was seamlessly woven into their sophisticated understanding of time and the stars. The Maya calendar was not just a way to mark days, it was a sacred machine that revealed the will of the gods. The colors of administration directly corresponded to its cycles. A decree issued during a period ruled by a benevolent rain god might be painted in that fertile turquoise, while a law enacted under the influence of a warlike celestial body could be stamped with a darker, more ominous blue-green. The evidence for this integrated system is painted across their temple complexes. At sites like Calakmul, archaeologists have found that certain administrative buildings, those thought to house royal scribes, were painted entirely in this sacred blue, visually connecting the work of bureaucracy directly to the heavens. Furthermore, the placement of colors on a temple's facade was a deliberate narrative. A staircase leading to a shrine might begin with steps painted in earthy greens, representing the mortal world. As you ascended, the colors would shift through various shades of turquoise, symbolizing the journey through different layers of the cosmos, until you reached the summit, which was often coded in that ultimate, divine Maya blue. This was a physical and visual representation of the king's authority, a climb from the profane to the profound, all articulated through pigment. A royal tax record was therefore more than an economic document, it was a cosmological statement. When a king declared the tribute owed by a subject city, the order was not written on simple paper. It was likely rendered on polished stucco or fine pottery, with the numerical calculations presented in the inescapable, godlike blue. The subject reading this order would not just see a demand for goods, they would see a command endorsed by the very sky above them. This system made resistance not just an act of political rebellion, but a form of sacrilege. The Maya emerald bureaucracy brilliantly fused the practical needs of statecraft with a deep spiritual belief, creating a governing language where every shade of green and blue whispered of both earthly power and celestial destiny. It was a reminder that for them, the most effective laws were those that appeared to be written not by man, but by the universe itself. A city was more than a collection of buildings, it was a living document, its laws and social order painted directly onto its walls and streets. This principle of chromatic governance extended deep into the very fabric of urban planning, creating entire environments that guided their citizens with a silent, visual logic. In these cities, you did not need a map or written signs to find your way. You simply had to follow the colors. Specific districts were painted in dedicated color schemes that announced their purpose to everyone. A residential quarter might be a sea of warm, earthy tones, soft ochres and pale browns that signified private life and domesticity. But just a few streets over, the walls would shift to a uniform, brilliant white. This was the commercial district where the clean, bright color created a sense of openness and facilitated trade, making goods easier to see and transactions feel more transparent. The most commanding area was always the administrative and sacred core. Here, the palette was deliberately restricted to the rarest and most authoritative pigments. In many cultures, this meant a dominant, imposing blue or a gleaming, solar gold, colors that screamed of power, divinity, and law. You knew instinctively that this was not a place for casual loitering, but for official business and reverence. The pathways connecting these districts were just as deliberately coded. Major thoroughfares leading to the central temples or palaces were often paved and then coated with a distinctive colored plaster. A wide avenue painted a deep red or a shimmering yellow was a processional route, reserved for official parades, religious festivals, and the movement of the elite. The common populace used a separate network of unpainted, earth-toned lanes and alleys. Your social status and your reason for traveling literally determined the color of the road you walked upon. This system created an intuitive navigation network that was remarkably effective. a visiting merchant from a foreign land who spoke not a word of the local language could still conduct his business efficiently. He would enter through the city gate, find the white-painted commercial zone, locate the street marked with a specific color stripe for his trade guild, and then follow the red road to the administrative district to have his goods officially sealed and taxed. He required no translator, only a basic understanding of the city's universal color code. The stunning part is how this approach emerged independently across the globe. The yellow brick road is not just a fairy tale, it is a faint cultural memory of this reality. From the golden pathways of Teotihuacan to the whitewashed commercial agoras of Greek city-states and the blue-glazed administrative centers of the Indus Valley, we see the same solution to the same problem. How do you manage a dense, complex urban population with minimal written literacy? You build a city that speaks to its people through a silent, enduring, and beautifully simple language of color. But this silent language of color reached its ultimate expression not in a single city, but across an entire empire. The Romans engineered a continent-spanning nervous system painted in shades of scarlet. Along the vast network of Roman roads, a series of official message stations stood ready to relay imperial commands. These were not just buildings, they were visual signal posts. When a courier arrived carrying a dispatch, the station's facade would be marked with a specific shade of red to broadcast the message's nature to the next rider waiting inside. A pale, brick-red wash indicated a routine update, perhaps a provincial governor's monthly report, but a deep, blood-red stain across the doorway signaled an urgent military dispatch or a decree from the emperor himself. This color code allowed the entire relay system to preemptively prepare, ensuring the fastest possible horses and the most experienced riders were ready to carry the most critical information forward without a moment's delay. The system's genius was its layered urgency. A message sealed with a simple red wax stamp was an official document, but one that could travel at a normal pace. However, a scroll whose seal was surrounded by a hand-painted crimson circle demanded immediate attention, and a dispatch tube entirely coated in a brilliant vermilion, the most expensive and vibrant red, represented an imperial command that overrode all other traffic on the road. A rider carrying such a tube had the absolute right of way, and the sight of that blazing color compelled all other travelers to clear the path instantly. This color coding extended to the very bones of the empire. Archaeologists studying Roman mile markers and boundary stones have found that many were not plain stone. They were originally painted with the most critical information highlighted in red ochre. The distance to Rome or to the nearest major city was often inscribed and then filled with a bright red pigment, making it legible from a distance even to a tired traveler. A boundary stone marking the edge of imperial territory would have its imperial insignia painted in the same authoritative scarlet, a constant, silent reminder of Roman law etched into the landscape itself. Evidence from sites like Hadrian's Wall in Britain reveals that the gates of major forts were also marked with specific red patterns, signaling the rank of the commanding officer stationed within or the unit's current alert status. This scarlet network transformed abstract imperial authority into a tangible, ever-present reality. For a citizen or soldier living in a distant province, the sight of that specific red on a milestone, a sealed message, or a fort gate was a direct visual link to the power of Rome. It was a system that ensured the emperor's will could flash across thousands of miles with the speed of a galloping horse and the unmistakable command of a single, sovereign color. The vibrant empires of color began to fade, not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. For all their elegance and intuitive power, these chromatic systems carried within them the seeds of their own obsolescence. The first and most profound challenge came from the rise of alphabetic writing. A single shade of crimson could command someone to pay a tax, but it could not specify the exact amount, the type of grain, or the deadline for payment. As societies grew more populous and their economies more intricate, this lack of precision became a critical weakness. Written language offered a limitless vocabulary for nuance. A clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform could detail a contract with clauses, exceptions, and witness names, creating a legal record that was infinitely more specific and less open to misinterpretation than even the most sophisticated color sequence. The flexibility was equally transformative. A written law could be easily amended or repealed with a new document, whereas changing the meaning of a sacred, state-controlled color would require retraining an entire population and undermining a foundational symbol of power. The administrative world was shifting from broad, symbolic commands to detailed, literal instructions, and color simply could not keep up. Simultaneously, the very scarcity that gave these pigments their authority began to evaporate. New trade routes crisscrossed continents, connecting previously isolated sources of rare minerals and dyes to global markets. The lapis lazuli mines of Afghanistan were no longer the sole province of kings, their brilliant blue now available to wealthy merchants and even aspiring artists. Technological breakthroughs in chemistry and mass production further democratized color. The invention of synthetic pigments and cheaper, more efficient dyeing processes meant that a vibrant red or a deep blue was no longer a state secret, but a commodity. When a prosperous merchant could afford to paint his own house in a shade once reserved for royalty, the color's power to command obedience and signify divine right evaporated. The visual language of power was being diluted, its vocabulary stolen by the very economic forces the state had helped to create. Ultimately, these systems were overwhelmed by their own success. The very empires that chromatic governance helped build became too complex for it to manage. How could a simple gradient of 5 reds possibly administer the tax codes for 100 different professions across 1 million people? How could a system of colored chords catalog the intricate legal precedents of a sprawling judicial system? The symbolic capacity of color, while powerful, was fundamentally limited. It was a brilliant tool for broadcasting a simple message to a largely illiterate populace, but a terrible one for storing the vast, interlocking data of a mature bureaucracy. The transition was a slow, centuries-long unraveling. You can see it in the archaeological record, where colorful seals are gradually replaced by lengthy scrolls, and painted pottery shards give way to inscribed ledgers. This was not merely a change in technology, but a fundamental shift in the architecture of human thought. We moved from governing through universal symbols that everyone could feel, to governing through specialized text that required training to decode. The world became more precise, more detailed, and infinitely more complex, but something was lost in the translation, the immediate, visceral understanding that once flowed from a single, commanding splash of color. Deep within the jungles of Cambodia, the stone giants of Angkor Wat have been keeping a secret. For centuries, we saw only their gray, weathered skin, but recent technology has peeled back the layers of time to reveal a city that once blazed with color. Multispectral imaging, a technique that uses different wavelengths of light to detect faded residues, has uncovered ghostly patterns of pigment on the temple's vast walls. These are not random decorations, they are the faded remnants of a sophisticated administrative code that organized one of the world's largest religious complexes. The scans show that entire sections of the temple were once painted in specific, governing hues. The central towers, the domain of the god-king, were likely coated in a sacred and unapproachable gold, a visual declaration of his divinity. The long, covered galleries where thousands of pilgrims would gather were washed in a calming, devotional blue, guiding the public in their worship and setting a tone of reverence. Meanwhile, the countless auxiliary buildings that fanned out from the core were marked with more practical colors. A structure painted in a humble, earthy red ochre might have been a storage facility for the temple's vast rice reserves. A building marked with a vibrant green could have been an administrative office managing the schedules of thousands of priests and artisans. This color system turned the sprawling, chaotic city temple into a model of efficiency. A newly arrived worker would not need a map or a spoken command. He would simply look for the building marked with the specific shade of green that signaled the artisan's quarter, report there, and then be directed to a work site by following a path of painted stones leading to a structure gleaming in the yellow of ongoing construction. The coordination required for such a massive operation was staggering. The temple required a constant flow of resources, food for its inhabitants, flowers for daily offerings, water for its sacred moats, and precious materials for its endless maintenance. The color code managed this flow seamlessly. A priest, noticing that the red ochre storehouse was looking faded, could order more supplies from the surrounding villages with a simple, colored token. The system's true genius was its ability to harmonize the sacred and the profane. The same visual language that directed a farmer delivering his tax of rice also guided a priest through the most elaborate royal ceremony. The gold that proclaimed the king's divine right was part of the same spectrum as the green that managed the repair of a drainage canal. This was chromatic governance at its most holistic, a silent, polychrome pulse that synchronized the spiritual and the logistical, allowing a civilization of millions to focus its collective will on a single stone prayer reaching for the heavens. These ghostly pigments are now being brought back to life by the cold, precise eye of modern science. Hyperspectral imaging cameras, mounted on drones flying over ancient ruins, can detect the faintest chemical signatures of color long since faded to nothing. They scan stone surfaces with light wavelengths far beyond what our eyes can see, revealing hidden patterns and palettes. In a laboratory, a tiny fleck of dust, seemingly gray to the naked eye, is placed under a spectrometer. The machine bombards it with energy, reading the unique way its molecules vibrate to identify its original hue with absolute certainty. This is not guesswork. We are now decoding the exact chemical recipes for Minoan reds and Maya blues, understanding not just their color, but their source, their age, and even the trade routes that brought them to the artist's palette. These technologies are acting as a time machine, stripping away centuries of weathering to show us these cities not as skeletal ruins, but as the vibrant, color-coded organisms they truly were. One stunning project at a site in Anatolia used this data to create a full digital model of a Bronze Age administrative complex. As you virtually walk through the reconstruction, the building's purpose becomes instantly clear. The tax collection office glows in a warning crimson, the legal archives are bathed in a stable, trustworthy blue, and the courtyard where official proclamations were red shimmers with authoritative gold. This digital resurrection is fundamentally changing our understanding of administrative history. For centuries, we assumed that bureaucracy evolved in a straight line from simple memory to written records. But these colorful reconstructions reveal a parallel path, a sophisticated and highly effective system of non-textual governance that rivaled the complexity of early writing. It challenges the very definition of literacy, suggesting that these societies were highly literate in a visual language we are only now relearning. The most ambitious reconstructions go beyond single buildings. Researchers are piecing together entire chromatic landscapes, mapping how color guided movement, denoted status, and enforced law across a city. They can now simulate the experience of an ancient citizen, showing how a specific sequence of colored walls and pathways would have intuitively directed them from their home to their workplace and to the tax collector without a single written street sign. This rediscovery forces us to ask a profound question. In our rush toward textual complexity, did we lose a more universal form of communication? The power of these systems lay in their immediacy, their ability to be understood by anyone, regardless of their education or native language. As we now stand surrounded by our own complex digital interfaces, there is a certain irony in using our most advanced technology to appreciate the elegant simplicity of a world governed by pigment. Even a republic as formidable as Venice understood that power must be made visible to be understood. In the corridors of the Doge's palace, a delicate balance of authority was maintained not through shouted arguments, but through a silent language of gold and silver. The Venetian Republic perfected a dual color system where these metallic pigments represented the core principles of their government. Gold, the color of the sun and ultimate sovereignty, was reserved for the Doge himself and the most sacred symbols of the state. His official decrees were inscribed on parchment with brilliant gold leaf, and his personal seal was impressed in gold wax. This was the color of executive action, of final judgment, and of Venice's divine right to rule the waves. Silver, in stark contrast, represented the deliberative and legislative branches. The Great Council, the body of noblemen who made the laws, conducted its business with silver. Their official rosters were written in silver ink, and the ballots used in their intricate voting processes were small, polished silver beads. This created a brilliant visual system of checks and balances. A proposal from the Doge, written in gold, would be sent to the Great Council for debate and approval, a process documented entirely in silver. The two colors had to meet for any law to be born, a constant reminder that no single branch could act alone. This metallic code permeated the very architecture of power. The Doge's private chambers were adorned with gold leaf on the ceilings and walls, while the vast hall where the Great Council met was a symphony of silver, from the metallic threads in the tapestries to the sheen of the polished benches. A citizen summoned to the palace would know immediately which branch of government they were dealing with by the dominant metallic hue of the room they entered. Surviving documents in the Venetian state archives provide stunning proof. You can see tax records where the total amount owed is written in bold gold numerals, the authority of the state making its demand, while the detailed calculations and the signatures of the auditing council are meticulously noted in a cool, verifying silver. This was more than decoration. It was a constitutional principle rendered in pigment. The system ensured that the complex, often fragile machinery of republicanism functioned with visual clarity. Everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest merchant, could see the balance of power in the glint of gold and the gleam of silver, a silent, shimmering contract that helped a city built on water stand firm for 1,000 years. The echoes of those ancient, painted laws still whisper in the corridors of modern power. We no longer govern with jars of crimson or seals of lapis lazuli, but the ghost of chromatic governance lives on in the very language we use to describe bureaucracy. Consider the term red tape, a universal symbol of frustrating delay and inflexible regulation. Its origin is startlingly literal. In 16th century England, administrative documents were literally bound with red tape or red ribbon to signify their importance and separate them from mundane paperwork. This was a direct, if faded, inheritance from systems like the Persian color codes, where a specific red marked a document as an official, unassailable command. The color itself was chosen for the same reasons it was used in Minoan tax jars. It commanded attention and signaled an urgent, non-negotiable state matter. Today, the tape is metaphorical, but the color's association with binding authority remains. Similarly, so-called blue laws, regulations that restrict certain activities on Sundays, draw their name from the blue paper on which these Puritan ordinances were originally printed in colonial New Haven. The choice of blue was likely not accidental, echoing the ancient use of that color from Harappa to Athens to signify permanent, moral, and foundational rules. The color lent an air of timeless, almost divine permanence to these social restrictions. This historical legacy is physically embedded in our government buildings and documents. Walk into a passport office or a courthouse today, and you will be surrounded by a familiar palette. Official seals almost universally feature deep blues and golds, colors once reserved for royalty and divine right, now repurposed to convey the legitimacy and stability of the state. Important certificates are often printed on paper with subtle color washes, a pale blue or a faint golden hue, a subconscious cue that this is a serious, permanent record. Even the simple act of highlighting a critical line in a legal contract with a yellow marker is a micro-level application of the same principle the Athenians used when they underlined laws with black paint, a visual signal that says, "Pay attention, this part is crucial." Perhaps the most fascinating modern evolution is happening on our screens. The designers of our digital world, often without any historical knowledge, are unconsciously replicating these ancient color associations. Your banking app likely uses green for positive balances and financial growth, a direct link to the fertile, life-giving greens used in many ancient systems. Warnings and error messages almost universally flash in red, tapping into that primal urgency that made red so effective for tax collection and royal commands. The interface for submitting your taxes online might guide you through a process where completed steps are marked in a calm, stable blue, while urgent actions required are highlighted in a demanding red or orange. We are building new virtual bureaucracies that run on the same color-coded logic as Teotihuacan or Tyre, because the human brain is still wired to respond to these visual commands in the same way. Understanding this long history provides a profound insight. The colors we use for administration are not arbitrary. They are the living fossils of a forgotten language of power, a chromatic legacy that continues to shape how we perceive order, authority, and law, proving that even in our complex digital age, we still think in the vivid pigments of our past. The Byzantine court was a living tapestry of power, where every thread's color was a word in a silent legal code. At the heart of this empire in Constantinople, administrators perfected a system where the color of an official's silk robe or the ink on a scroll communicated more than any spoken decree. They maintained a vast bureaucracy using a meticulously detailed chromatic codex, a set of rules that governed every hue used in the halls of power. An imperial document was not just read, it was assessed. The ink itself told you everything you needed to know. A proclamation written in a standard, dark brown ink was for public consumption, a routine announcement. But a scroll inscribed with a specific, deep crimson red signaled a matter of high urgency, perhaps a military dispatch or a tax demand that required immediate action. The most secretive of all, documents pertaining to state security or sensitive diplomatic negotiations, were often written in a rare and expensive purple ink, a color so closely associated with the emperor that its use was a declaration of supreme authority. This was not a suggestion, it was a legally binding visual language. The evidence for this system is preserved in surviving administrative manuals like the Cletorologion of Philotheos. This ancient guidebook does not just list court titles, it prescribes the exact colors each official must wear. A low-ranking scribe might be permitted only a tunic with a single, thin stripe of pale green. A mid-level minister could wear a robe of solid blue, while a supreme general, a strategos, was entitled to a specific shade of deep scarlet and a cloak trimmed with gold thread. Your rank was not something you had to announce, it was woven into the very fabric you wore each day. This extended to the complex rituals of the court. When the emperor received foreign ambassadors, the arrangement of officials in the throne room was a carefully choreographed spectrum. The visitors would be confronted by a wall of color, a gradient from the humble greens and blues of the junior administrators on the periphery to the blazing golds and purples of the inner circle surrounding the emperor himself. The message was instantaneous and overwhelming, a silent demonstration of imperial hierarchy designed to intimidate and impress. The Byzantine system represents the most exquisitely documented form of chromatic governance, a bureaucracy that managed its vast complexity not with endless paperwork alone, but with a sovereign command of color. It was a world where law and order were not just written down, but worn on your sleeve for all to see. The same urgent red that commanded taxes in Minoan Crete appeared in the imperial seals of Persia. A deep, stable blue that defined law in the Indus Valley also colored the courtrooms of classical Athens. These parallel discoveries are too consistent to be coincidence. Across the globe, in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, administrators arrived at the same color-coded solutions for governing their people. This was not a shared idea, but a shared human instinct. The patterns are unmistakable. Warm colors, the reds, oranges, and yellows, were almost universally adopted for commands that demanded an immediate response. Think of the crimson tax jars, the scarlet Roman dispatches, the golden pathways of Teotihuacan. These are the colors of fire, of blood, of a ripened fruit that must be picked now. They trigger a primal alertness in our brains, raising heart rates and focusing our attention, making them the perfect tool for directives that required swift action and compliance. In stark contrast, cool colors like blue and green were consistently reserved for what was permanent and foundational. The lapis lazuli glaze of Harappan administrative centers, the blue highlighted laws of Athens, the turquoise of Maya divine decrees. These are the colors of the sky and the deep sea, elements that are constant and unchanging. They promote a sense of calm and stability, lending an air of eternal truth to the laws and rights they represented. The reason for this lies deep within our shared human neurology. Our visual systems are wired to respond to these wavelengths in predictable ways. The long wavelengths of red light are processed by the brain as a signal of importance and urgency, a leftover from our evolutionary past where red often meant danger or opportunity. This is why a warning light on your dashboard is red, and why a stop sign is not green. The ancient rulers intuitively understood this. They did not need modern psychology to tell them that a red jar would make a farmer hasten to pay his grain tax, or that a blue proclaimed law would feel as immutable as the heavens. An illiterate farmer in Crete and a merchant in Mesopotamia, who could not understand a word of each other's languages, would have felt the same instinctual pull from a shade of royal crimson and the same calm deference from a field of deep blue. This universal language of pigment was built upon the common hardware of the human brain. It reveals that the most effective bureaucracy is not necessarily the most complex, but the one that speaks most directly to our innate biological responses. High on a sheer cliff face, the sun-baked stones of an Anasazi dwelling appear at first to be a uniform, dusty red. But look closer, and a subtle language of governance begins to emerge from the very plaster coating the walls. In these compact, multi-story villages built into towering alcoves, every inch of space was precious, and the ancestral pueblones developed a remarkably sophisticated system to organize their complex community life. They used carefully controlled gradients of local clay pigments to paint different sections of their architecture, creating a silent, visual map that everyone understood. A living quarters might be coated in a common, light reddish-brown, a practical and readily available color. But just a few feet away, a storage room for the community's vital grain reserves would be marked with a distinct, deeper terracotta hue. The most important spaces, the subterranean kivas used for religious ceremonies and council meetings, were often plastered with a unique, dark maroon or even a striking white clay, setting them apart as the administrative and spiritual heart of the village. This was not random decoration. It was a chromatic bureaucracy painted directly onto their world. In a settlement where hundreds of people lived in incredibly close quarters, this color coding prevented chaos. A returning hunter would know to deposit his share of the hunt in the building marked with the specific shade for communal food storage. A farmer, checking the status of the seed corn reserve, would be directed by the color of a doorway. The system's true genius was its role in survival. The Anasazi thrived in an unforgiving desert environment where water was scarce and the growing season was short. Coordination was a matter of life and death. The color gradients helped manage this with stunning efficiency. When the spring rains arrived, a signal from the white plastered kiva, perhaps a painted symbol or a change in the doorway's hue, could trigger the entire community to begin planting in a synchronized wave. The distribution of water rights, a critically limited resource, was almost certainly managed through this visual code. A household's access to irrigation water from a complex system of canals and reservoirs might have been denoted by a specific color pattern painted near their door, a public and unquestionable record of their allocation. Recent archaeological work is finally deciphering this faded system. Using portable X-ray fluorescence machines, scientists can analyze the chemical composition of ancient plaster walls without damaging them. They have discovered that what looks to our eyes like a single color is actually a precise mixture of different local clays and minerals. At sites like Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon, researchers have mapped entire cliff dwellings and found that the pigment formulas change in inconsistent, predictable ways from one room type to another. The plaster from a standard living room has one chemical signature, while the plaster from a granary has a distinctly different one, proving that the color distinction was intentional and systematic. This subtle chromatic organization demonstrates a profound truth about human societies. Even in the most challenging and seemingly unstructured environments, we have an innate drive to create order. The Anasazi did not need towering blue pyramids or crimson tax jars. They crafted a government from the very earth beneath their feet, using the quiet gradient of a canyon wall to coordinate a civilization. A silent testament to the universal human need to paint our laws upon the world. These forgotten bureaucracies of pigment force us to rewrite the political science textbooks. The conventional story of state formation is a linear march from oral traditions to written records, a narrative where literacy is the non-negotiable prerequisite for complex administration. Yet the vibrant evidence from Teotihuacan, the Indus Valley, and the Inca Empire presents a glaring anomaly. These were not simple chiefdoms, they were sophisticated, large-scale states that managed resources, labor, and law for centuries without relying on a single decipherable word. Their existence proves that social complexity is not a product of a single technology, but a flexible adaptation to human needs. The state did not need to be read to be real, it only needed to be seen and universally understood. This reveals a fundamental truth about political organization, that its core function is to create and maintain order, and color proved to be a remarkably efficient medium for that order. These systems achieved something that written bureaucracies often struggle with: They made the law instinctively accessible to every member of society, from the highest priest to the most humble farmer. There was no information asymmetry, no special class of scribes needed to interpret the will of the state. The law was painted on the world, a constant, silent, and democratic presence. This challenges our deep-seated bias that equates administrative sophistication with textual complexity. We are forced to consider that for a significant portion of human history, the most advanced form of data processing was not stored on clay, but in carefully controlled hues. The success of these chromatic governments suggests that political power can be just as effectively, and perhaps more intuitively, broadcast through symbols that speak directly to our shared human neurology. So what can our modern, text-saturated governments learn from these ancient polities? The lesson is not to abandon writing, but to recognize the enduring power of visual simplicity. In an era of overwhelming digital information and complex legal jargon, the principles of chromatic governance are more relevant than ever. The design of a government website, the color coding of public health alerts, or the intuitive signage in a civic center are all modern applications of this ancient wisdom. Using color to create clear, immediate understanding can bridge literacy gaps, transcend language barriers, and reduce administrative friction. A well-designed, color-coded tax form is easier for everyone to navigate, not just those with legal training. The goal is to harness that primal, instant recognition that these ancient rulers mastered, the kind of communication that requires no translation. Yet for all their elegance, these systems did possess inherent limitations that ultimately led to their decline. A color-based code is brilliant for broadcasting clear, simple commands, but it is terrible at storing nuance. A crimson jar can command a tax payment, but it cannot specify exemptions for a poor harvest or detail the appeals process. As economies diversified and legal systems grew more intricate, the symbolic capacity of a limited color palette was quickly overwhelmed. Writing offered an essentially infinite vocabulary for detail, conditionality, and precedent. Furthermore, the stability of these chromatic systems relied on a monopoly over rare pigments. Once trade routes expanded and chemical knowledge democratized, the state's exclusive grip on the language of power was broken. When any wealthy merchant could paint his door in a shade once reserved for royalty, the color's authority dissolved. The transition to text was not merely a technological upgrade. It was a necessary evolution to manage the breathtaking complexity that these very color-coded states had helped to create. Their success built a world that required a more precise and flexible tool. In the end, these silent cities of color offer us a profound insight that the foundation of political order is not a specific technology, but the human capacity to create shared meaning. Whether through a splash of vermilion or a paragraph of legal text, the state is, at its heart, a communal agreement made visible. High on the Ethiopian plateau, a kingdom was still whispering in the old language of color while the world typed on typewriters. The Ethiopian Empire represents a living fossil, the last place where chromatic governance did not just survive but thrived, woven into the very fabric of the state until the 20th century. This was not a mere artistic tradition, it was a functioning administrative system. In the royal court and the powerful Ethiopian Orthodox Church, specific colors carried precise, non-negotiable meanings that everyone from a peasant to a prince was expected to understand. The brilliant yellow of a manuscript's border was not a decorative choice, it was a legal one. That particular shade, derived from precious saffron, was reserved exclusively for documents issued by the emperor himself, signaling an imperial decree that overrode all other authority. A deep, vibrant red made from crushed cochineal marked a document as a tax record or a military dispatch, demanding immediate action just as it had in ancient Crete. And the most sacred blue, a color painstakingly created from imported indigo and local minerals, was used for foundational church law and land grants, presenting them as eternal and divine, much like the lapis lazuli proclamations of the Harappans. This system persisted not out of stubbornness, but because of Ethiopia's unique geographical and historical isolation. Shielded by formidable mountains and successfully resisting colonial conquest, the empire evolved on its own terms. There was no external pressure to abandon its ancient visual codes for a purely Western, text-based model. Instead, the old and the new merged. Scribes created hybrid documents where written Amharic text was organized and given its authority by the colors that framed it. A recently studied land grant from the Imperial Archives shows this fusion perfectly. The body of the document is written in Black Amharic script, detailing the boundaries and obligations of the property. But the critical clauses, the ones stating the grant was irrevocable and hereditary, are highlighted with a hand-painted border of that unassailable saffron yellow. The color did not just emphasize the words, it authenticated them, granting the text a level of authority that the writing alone could not achieve. In the church, this was even more pronounced. Illuminated manuscripts were, in effect, legal and theological databases. A priest could open a sacred text and, by reading the colors, instantly know which passages were liturgical instructions, which were moral laws, and which were historical records of land donations to the monastery. The system extended to the robes of power. The emperor's ceremonial attire was a symphony of administrative meaning. His cloak of imperial purple communicated his sovereignty, while the specific green of his tunic might denote his role as supreme judge. A high-ranking general's uniform featured a prescribed pattern of red and black, visually encoding his rank and the number of soldiers under his command to anyone in the court. This was chromatic governance in its final, refined form. Ethiopia did not just use color, it integrated it seamlessly with a written language, creating a dual-layer bureaucracy that was both sophisticated and instantly legible. It stands as the definitive endpoint of a governance tradition that spanned millennia, a final, vivid echo of a time when the world was painted in law. The principles that guided a Minoan tax collector are now being written into the code of our digital world. The same intuitive, color-coded logic that managed ancient empires is re-emerging as a foundational language for our complex global society. Look at the screen of your smartphone. Your banking app uses a calm green for your savings, a color of growth and stability, while urgent alerts flash in a warning red that triggers an immediate primal response. This is not a coincidence. Modern user interface design is, in essence, a new form of chromatic governance, guiding billions of people through complex digital bureaucracies without the need for lengthy instruction manuals. The icons on your desktop, the status bars in your software, the color-coded maps of a global shipping network, all function like the painted seals of the Persian Empire, communicating dense information through a universally understood visual shorthand. These systems work because they tap into the same deep-seated human neurology that made a crimson tax jar so effective. They reduce cognitive load, allowing us to navigate immense complexity with intuitive ease. The parallels extend to data visualization, where complex global trends are translated into heat maps and colored graphs. A climate scientist can look at a world map awash in gradients from cool blue to fiery red and instantly understand the patterns of a changing planet, a form of communication that transcends language and literacy, much like the Quipu chords of the Inca. This ancient wisdom holds profound potential for contemporary global challenges. How do you coordinate disaster relief for a population that speaks dozens of languages? How do you convey public health information to a global audience? The answer may lie not in translating endless text, but in designing clear, color-coded symbolic systems that anyone can understand. Imagine a universal set of symbols and colors for medical aid, food distribution, or safe routes, a visual language that could be deployed anywhere on Earth during a crisis. Modern technology is perfectly poised to adapt these pre-literate methods, not to replace text, but to augment it, creating a dual-layer system of communication, just as the Ethiopians did with their illuminated manuscripts. The future of administration may not be more text, but smarter symbols. As we build the virtual realities and augmented worlds of tomorrow, the most effective interfaces will likely be those that speak the oldest language, using color not merely for decoration, but for command, clarity, and connection, proving that the most enduring solutions are often written in the most vivid pigments. Our journey through these painted governments reveals a startling truth about human society. We have long believed that civilization marched in a straight line from oral traditions to the written word, that literacy was the essential engine of complex states. But the silent, vibrant evidence of Teotihuacan, the Indus Valley, and the Inca Empire tells a different story. These were not primitive cultures, they were sophisticated, large-scale polities that managed resources, labor, and law for centuries without a single decipherable text. Their existence forces us to expand our definition of administration. The state did not need to be read to be real, it only needed to be seen and understood by all. The true function of government is to create and maintain order, and for a significant stretch of human history, color was one of the most elegant and efficient tools for that very purpose. These chromatic systems achieved something that our modern, text-saturated bureaucracies often struggle with. They made the law instinctively accessible. An illiterate farmer in Crete and a merchant in Mesopotamia, who could not understand a word of each other's languages, would have felt the same instinctual pull from a shade of royal crimson. There was no special class of scribes needed to interpret the state's will, because the law was painted on the world, a constant and democratic presence. This challenges our deep-seated bias that equates sophistication with textual complexity. We must consider that for millennia, the most advanced form of data processing was not stored on clay tablets alone, but in carefully controlled, universally understood hues. The success of these governments proves that political power can be broadcast just as effectively through symbols that speak directly to our shared human neurology. So what can we, in our age of overwhelming digital information, learn from these ancient polities? The lesson is not to abandon writing, but to embrace the enduring power of visual simplicity. The design of a clear government website, the color coding of a public health alert, or the intuitive signage in a civic center are all modern applications of this ancient wisdom. Using color to create immediate understanding can bridge literacy gaps, transcend language barriers, and reduce the friction of modern life. A well-designed, color-coded tax form is easier for everyone to navigate. The goal is to harness that primal, instant recognition these ancient rulers mastered, the kind of communication that requires no translation. Yet for all their elegance, these systems did possess inherent limitations that ultimately led to their quiet fade. A color-based code is brilliant for broadcasting clear, simple commands, but it is terrible at storing nuance. A crimson jar can command a tax payment, but it cannot specify exemptions for a poor harvest or detail a lengthy appeals process. As economies diversified and legal systems grew more intricate, the symbolic capacity of a limited color palette was overwhelmed. Writing offered an essentially infinite vocabulary for detail, conditionality, and precedent. Furthermore, the stability of these chromatic governments relied on an absolute monopoly over rare pigments. Once trade routes expanded and chemical knowledge democratized, the state's exclusive grip on the language of power was broken. When any wealthy merchant could paint his door in a shade once reserved for royalty, the color's authority dissolved. The transition to text was not merely a technological upgrade. It was a necessary evolution to manage the breathtaking complexity that these very color-coded states had helped to create. Their own success built a world that required a more precise and flexible tool. In the end, these silent cities of color offer us a profound insight that the foundation of political order is not a specific technology, but the human capacity to create shared meaning. Whether through a splash of vermilion or a paragraph of legal text, the state is, at its heart, a communal agreement made visible. The next time you see the deep blue of a police uniform, the gold seal on a diploma, or the red tape of a delayed permit, remember you are not just looking at a color. You are witnessing a faded echo of a time when the world was not just described by words, but governed by the silent, sovereign power of pigment. If these vibrant stories of painted laws and silent bureaucracies have sparked your curiosity, the journey into color's hidden history is only just beginning. Tell us in the comments which civilization resonated with you most. Was it the Inca and their knotted rainbow, the Minoans and their crimson tax jars, or perhaps the silent blue codes of the Harappans? Have you noticed echoes of these ancient systems in the world around you, in the design of an app or the colors of a government building? Your insights and observations help build a living conversation, piecing together this forgotten past. To ensure you do not miss our explorations into other lost chapters of history, subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. For those eager to dive even deeper, the video description contains a curated list of recommended books and scientific papers on archaeological color analysis, from the chemistry of Maya blue to the digital reconstruction of painted cities. Your engagement and support are what allow us to continue researching and sharing these stories, helping to restore the full, brilliant palette to our understanding of the human